I have just felt so humbled and honored that number one, Travis would trust me with a story like this. And to Scott, I want to thank you for being willing to open up and trust me with your story. And this project, has brought so many wonderful memories to me that I know I will tell my kids and grandkids someday. Just amazing adventures and stories. And just to kind of give a little background, the timing of this film was perfect in my life because when Travis came to me, this was about 3 or 4 years ago during COVID. I had actually just walked my mom through cancer. I don't want to get emotional here, but I don't think I would have been able to direct this film and give Scott's story justice unless I had walked through that with my mom and experienced that. And so it was just such a godsend, this story in my life, in so many ways to inspire me. And it's still a story that, I feel like I am needing in my life and will continue on. The message of it is something I will live out in my life. Documentary filmmaking is very different than narrative filmmaking. And as a filmmaker, you're like, yeah. And then until you get into it, as you can see, Scott's story obviously had many twists and turns. And so I think for me, it just made me a lot more flexible and adaptable as a filmmaker and really appreciate the authenticity in real life stories. And that's why I really want to go in the documentary direction, because I love telling real people's stories as opposed to narrative film, which is just as good, but you don't have just that real raw emotion of getting to tell someone's real life. So I think it made me a lot more flexible and adaptable as a filmmaker.
Having CF is definitely going to make it a little more exciting, I guess you could say.
That's one way to say it.
Yeah, to be nice. The training, what you really need to do is nail down the training, the nutrition, making sure you're taking your medications on time, and all the stuff that goes along with that. And that's on top of, training for the crossing. And I tell everybody, whether you're doing an Ironman or you're doing the crossing, the mental training is much harder than the physical training. And people have asked me what was harder, the crossing or the Ironman, and I said the crossing. Because when you're doing an Ironman or any triathlon, if you get tired of swimming, big whoop, you're going to be on your bike pretty soon and it'll be rainbows and unicorns again. If you're paddling halfway across the ocean and you get tired of paddling, guess what you're going to be doing 2 hours later? So you got to get that mental aspect going too. But it's definitely a challenge, but I think it's definitely a challenge worth doing.
When I first started it, I think I stopped count at 40 hours, but probably hundreds, thousands of hours, probably, of 3 years of work. It took me, and thank you so much. It took me over a year to edit it. To rough cut it, it took me a year. And then from there, like David is saying, we showed it to a handful of people, and then we took their feedback and ended up putting in 2 more interviews. So the interview that you saw of Scott's dad, we actually flew to Mississippi. We really wanted...
Oh yeah, they were like, oh, we're gonna go interview your dad, and I'm like, oh. Are you sure you want to do that? You guys got to meet. Well, you met my dad, but he's a handful.
Yeah, he's funny. The same humor. But so yeah, we ended up putting in. We really felt like having that connection to Scott's backstory was really an emotional key point. And then we also got to interview Scott's actual lung transplant doctor. We flew to Yale and got to interview him at Yale University, and that was just really incredible as well. So that was kind of the second half, just a couple of the components of the second half of the film. So
I was invited to, it was the 10-year anniversary of the crossing, and I had, getting in the year and we're paddling and stuff like that, I just happened to call Travis and I said, hey man, if you need me to do anything, come over, speak, volunteer, be on the beach crew, whatever, I'll do it, whatever you want. And he said, well, funny you mentioned that, and funny you called today. And I'm like, oh God. So they were getting back the original 4 guys that paddled the first year. And one of them could not make it, and they asked me to join the team. And Travis, Kyle was sitting right here as well, and another gentleman named Shane, who I don't think is here. I haven't seen him. We paddled, and we came in 3rd place in the 4-person relay team last year. So that's, yeah.
Did you feel anything when they were taking out your lungs? Like, what did it feel like?
Well, fortunately, I was not conscious at the time. They knocked me out.
But, like, when you woke up, how did it feel? Like, did it hurt?
It was, I was on a lot of painkillers at that point, so it didn't hurt immediately. Funny story about that, it's kind of summarized in the documentary. You know, they came in to pull the tube out of my mouth. I had been awake for maybe half of the day at that point. And first of all, when you wake up and you got a tube down your throat, your immediate reaction is to panic. And so, you know, they had the nurse in there, and the doctor was in there, and for some reason my dad was standing behind everybody else. And, you know, they said, hey, you know, the surgery was a success. You know, you've got a tube in your throat. It's going to be in there for a little while. And, you know, I'm looking at the doctor and the nurse who are trying to explain how I'm not going to die in the next 5 minutes. And my dad's standing behind him like he's critiquing what the doctor's saying and whether he agrees with what he's saying or not. And then, you know, they finally got my dad to get out of the room, and they said, you're doing okay, so we're going to go ahead and take the breathing tube out. And, you know, they started undoing everything that secured it in, and the nurse comes up to me, and she was like, so this is how it's going to go. We're going to take a deep breath, we're going to let it out. We're going to take a deep breath, and when you let it out the second time, we're going to pull the cord out. I said, okay. She was like, to answer your question, this is going to hurt. I'm like, okay. And she was like, no, you don't understand what I'm saying. This is really going to hurt. And I'm like, okay, thanks for the confidence. I appreciate that. So she did the old trickaroo, and I breathed in, and on the first breath, she just yanked that thing out. And it felt like a mop was being pulled out of my lungs, basically, just cleaning everything on the way up. And at that moment, I mean, that's make it or break it. Whether you start breathing on your own or you're not, that is very, you know, that decides on what they're going to do next. And I immediately started breathing, and it was incredible. And, you know, I mentioned to it thank you. It was so quiet because when you have cystic fibrosis, you not only hear yourself breathe because you've got popping and cracking and all kinds of stuff going on, but you also feel it. I mean, you have scar tissue in your lungs, so you feel it kind of, every time it inflates, it kind of rubs against the inside of your rib cage. It's hard to describe if you haven't experienced. It's like a really bad cold.
Does it feel like sandpaper?
Sometimes it feels like sandpaper when you're breathing. So to go from that's all I knew for 29 years, to what I call quiet breathing, normal breathing. I had you have a pulse oximeter on your finger that counts the amount of oxygen in your blood. And I stared at that for hours because I couldn't believe that I was breathing. And I just kept waiting for it to go into the toilet. But so far, it hasn't happened. I always tell people, whenever you're training for Ironman, crossing, anything endurance related, the mental training is so much harder than the physical training. Physical training's hard, but the mental training, you know, just wrapping your brain around, you know, we'll say for the crossing, you're going to go over, you're going to hop on a board at midnight, and hopefully, if all things go well, sometime during the day, you'll be at the beach in Florida, you know, eventually. So I always tell people it's almost too big to think of in one chunk. So I always say, you know, you kind of have to break it up a little bit, you know. Get to the boat, number one. Get on your board, get to the boat, and then start paddling. Try not to fall down as much as possible, and then wait for the sun to come up. And then once the sun comes up, you know, just kind of get it in your mind like that. The physical training, you know, the more you train, the more you practice, you know, eating and taking breaks and using the bathroom in the ocean with no toilet paper and all the fun stuff that goes along with that. The easier it is when you get to crossing itself. People have asked me which is harder, the Ironman or the crossing. I always say the crossing, easily, because with the Ironman or any triathlon, if you get tired of swimming, don't worry about it. You'll be on your bike soon, and it'll all be rainbows and unicorns again, and then you'll go to the run. But if you get tired of paddling after 2 hours, guess what you're going to be doing in another 6 hours? Paddling. And that's where the mental aspect comes in that you have to get over.
I think for us, you know, going into this documentary filmmaking, I don't think any of us quite understood exactly what documentary filmmaking is very different from, you know, narrative filmmaking in that you're working with real people and real people's stories, and then you put them in a very, very uncontrolled environment with the ocean. And so it never, I don't think, dawned on our minds that, like, we were just not, it was devastating. Like, we had the whole crew there, and it just did not work out. The conditions were not in our favor. So I think that I really chose the words because I just wanted it to really sink in of, like, kind of what we all went through, and that we were fully expecting to do the race, and then it was just like, whoa, like things just happened. And so I felt like that pause kind of, and just letting that moment sink in with the words kind of would be maybe more impactful than someone like just narrating it.
Well, I've already done it again, to answer your question. So this past year was the 10-year anniversary of the start of the crossing. And, you know, I was getting around January. I hadn't heard from Travis yet. He's usually like, hey, it's beautiful in the Bahamas. Hint, hint, hint. But, you know, I hadn't heard from him yet, so I just gave him a call and I said, hey, man, you know, I don't know if I want to do the whole thing this year, but if you need me as a volunteer, if you need me to go over and speak, you know, whatever, I could do it. And his exact words were, oh, it's funny you called today. Funny you mentioned this. And what he was doing was he was getting the original 4 paddlers back together to do it as a team for the 10-year anniversary. And one of the paddlers couldn't make it. So he called me up and told me that I'd be crossing with them in June, which I thought was a great honor. I'm making light of it. But, and we had a fantastic time. I mean, it was kind of to give you kind of an insight of that first year and what it was after we got out of the shadow of the island. I described it one time online as getting on a bucking bronco and putting a blindfold on and then just going off. And somebody else that did the race, they were like, that's a great description. That's exactly how it was. So there was a little bit of that the first part of the night because there were storms that were going through, and then it smoothed out a lot. And then we ended up coming in 3rd place in the 4-person relay. So it was a good year. It was fun. It was a lot of fun. It's really hard to describe to people who have normal lives, you know, somebody that grows up with a terminal disease. You don't make future plans. You know, when my teachers say, hey, what do you want to do when you grow up? I'm just like, I don't know. I don't know how long I'm going to live. You know, it was never sugar-coated to me from a very young age from my parents or my doctors, which I'm thankful for. But, you know, growing up, you never say, you know, when I'm 30, I want to have 2 kids, a wife, and white picket fence, because you just don't want to set yourself up for that. But after the transplant, it was disoriented again because I hadn't planned for any of this part of my life. You know, I didn't save enough money or anything like that, and now I'm like, oh crap, I got to think about the future. So it's very fun being able to do what I always dreamed of when I was younger. I had a conversation with my father after the fact, and I said, Dad, I was like, I gotta be honest, I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants. And in a rare bit of wisdom that has come out of my father's mouth, he said, son, we're all flying by the seat of our pants, so you're no different. It's funny when you go through something like this that you feel like you have to make a stand. And I'll give you a good example. After I went through everything, you know, my mother smoked for years and years and years, and was still smoking. You know, I used to drive around with a lung disease in a station wagon with both parents smoking. But after you get out from something like that, you know, I tried to reason with her, and but everybody, we all have our demons, and we all have our own thing that you have to get. And I've been fortunate enough to live to an age where I realize that I'm just responsible for this right here. Myself, my wife, our family, our friends. If it doesn't affect that, I really don't spend that much time or energy on it. Throughout the pandemic and the election and everything like that, I really got into Stoic philosophy, which is pretty much the tenets of that. If it doesn't affect you directly, it's not worth wasting your time over. So, I mean, I get where you're saying, and if you feel like you need to speak to somebody, just use me as an example. Just say, hey, I went and saw this guy. You wouldn't believe what he went through just to fight to get to where he is right now. And here you are doing dumb shit through your life. But whether that person actually hears you or not, or if they're in a place in their life they can hear you or want to hear you, that's a totally different conversation. That list it's changed a little bit since then. I mean, that's where I was at 29 and wanted to rule the world after I got a lung transplant. But it was a lot of physical things. It was surfing. I was a big surfer, still a big surfer. Surfing here with my friends, climbing this mountain, climbing that mountain. And for some reason, and I don't know where it came from, because I didn't know anybody who did triathlon. For those of you who are old enough to remember the wide world of sports, I may have seen the Ironman championships on there, but it was just one of those things that popped in my head just to get through. I'm like, all right, it's going on the list, no matter how crazy it is. I've never shared that list with anybody. It is something that it's almost gained mythical status at this point, but it's just a list of things to do. It's a bucket list before it was called a bucket list, basically. I'm a firm believer of meditation. I was fortunate enough to go through one of the programs that Travis had through Piper's Angels that introduced me into meditation, and especially meditation for people with cystic fibrosis. And then since then, I've gone on to become a meditation instructor as well. And it just, for me to, because like I said at the end there, I'm just a normal everyday guy. I've got a job, I work a lot. And, between all this and we just bought a new house, so moving, I always feel like there's too much stuff going on in my life, and meditation is the one thing and the one time during the day that I could just sit, not do anything, not worry about anything, and that's it. I don't have time to do anything else. But the other things that I do, surfing and biking, and I mean, I also feel like there's a meditative state in that. It's just more active than just sitting.
Well, I think Travis kind of picked me and was like, yeah, it's a
pretty much. Yeah, and that was a big thing, not necessarily anybody. It would have been, hey, this is, and it's not necessarily the process itself, like I stated in my opening remarks. It was just bringing up the stuff that I, really wanted to tamp down and forget about and move on with my life. But then, in thinking about it, it moved me to want to share my story. And, Makayla made it so easy to she'd turn the camera on and just start asking questions, and that was pretty much it. And, I had never done anything like that beforehand, and, I didn't know what to expect, or, she was very gracious and only put one time when I was breaking up in there. There were several others. Then I asked her, I was like, how many are you putting in there? And she wouldn't tell me until the final cut. I got to see the final cut. But I think trust is something that just kind of came out of that. It didn't, I think if you try to force it, it's just not going to work. So it just has to be something organic that comes about throughout the process.
Like I just tried to get to know, like I just started on the phone with Scott, just tried to get to know his story and kind of, go into his world. We got to travel up to North Carolina, my mom and I actually, and I think we all just kind of forged like a genuine connection, and I mean, I'm very outdoorsy and adventure-y, and Scott and Leanne are both outdoorsy and adventure-y, so there's just like a natural connection there. So.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, that's such a valuable point to make, is trust, because If you've ever read or looked into anything related to teamwork, there's a book by Patrick Lencioni, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And the foundation of any team, any championship team, they've studied all these different teams, right, that have performed at the highest level. And trust is the foundation of any team. So if there's any fracture in that trust, everything that really needs to build on top of that, it won't happen. And there was one thing I could really, trust about Scott was that his story and his authenticity and how humble he was something that it was like, okay, the story's there, right? It will tell itself, in the right way. And it was like, okay, but the person who shares this story, for me, there had to be a very, very deep alignment in the values of what the story represented. The level of integrity, the courage to bring it to life. And when I met Makayla, even though she was really young, she still is, but like when I saw the project she was working on, it was immediate, like, wow, what her alignment was to what she wanted to bring into the world. It was like, okay, her North Star was there. So even though she was young, it was like, okay, I know the story's there, the North Star was there, her alignment and her values were there in the projects and content she had been creating. But then what was really also important was that knowing that he was going to do the crossing is such a formidable event to take on from a production standpoint. From an event production standpoint, the logistics, I apologize to our team all the time. I'm so sorry that we created the most complicated event in the world. I would put our team up against the team that produces the Super Bowl any day of the week. The Super Bowl, cookie cutter, cut and dry, same venue, same structure, same game, over and over and over. You can make that happen with a blindfold on. The crossing is almost, it's just crazy. Then to layer on a production on top of the production, right? So many of the team that was here filming, like, to not know what you're getting yourself into, to be out there in the middle of the ocean. And when I saw her work, the cinematography, which you guys just saw, like those expansive shots, those sunrise shots, the dolphins, the ocean, the shots of Scott floating. When we were on site, Makayla, she would have a vision for a shot. And it was like, well, I don't know if we have the time to make this happen. I don't know if we're going to get the circumstances or it was like, I would be standing back going like, I don't know. Maybe we're not going to actually be able to get this shot. And she was like, no, we got to get this shot. And I'm like, okay, yeah, we're going to get the shot. And I'm like, I don't know if we're really going to get the shot. And she's like, no, I really want to get this shot. And I'm like, okay, maybe she's a little stubborn. I don't know. Like, but then it was like, she would get the shot. And it was that resolve to make sure that she got what she needed in the vision of what she could see that was so impressive. And she would do it over and over. And I was like, over time, it was like I could just sink back into that trust. And it was like, oh my God, it's the right team. We did it. It's going to happen, And so to see it come together, and I mean, just the cinematography of this film, in my opinion, I don't think anybody could have captured the crossing with who she pulled in to make it happen. So great question, and thank you for letting me take the time to share, because that was such an important part of our journey. And it was really what in a way made it so special. And I will tell you over and over and over and over, now looking back in hindsight, if I ever had to do another documentary again, the one thing I would want is somebody who has the professionalism that Makayla has. She showed up to every meeting on time. She emailed follow-ups, detailed, thorough follow-ups, and it was like so refreshing to work with somebody who was so reliable that for me I could just trust. The whole way through the process it was going to be okay. And for a small foundation, investing, we raised over $27,000 on Kickstarter, investing the money into this, that's a lot of money for us. So to make sure that this was worth it, it was entrusted in her hands, and she made every dollar count, and she made every shot count, and I'm so grateful that, you know, this.
Thank you.
The trust that I have with her, even on like the 7th take, and she was like, that was fantastic. But let's do this again, and this time do it this way. I would be like, okay, I did something wrong, or she's got a vision that I have to do, so let's do it. Let's do it again. To answer your question, it kind of baffles me sometimes. And I realize everybody has days. I have days, everybody has days. But it kind of baffles me sometimes, especially nowadays with the internet and everything like that, that people get so upset and so uptight over stuff that does not affect them whatsoever. If I go somewhere and somebody's just wigging out about something, their steak wasn't done enough or something like that, and they're making a big scene, in my mind, I'm like, hey, if that's all you have to complain about, you're doing okay? Settle down. But I have to check myself sometimes too, because, it's been long enough. It'll be 23 years after my transplant this year. So it's been long enough that it's not even something that processes in my brain every day. I don't wake up, go, oh, day number 5,000 and, whatever after my transplant. So I have to check myself sometimes and be like, okay, you need to settle down about that, because that's not that big of a deal. And my wife has to put things in perspective for me sometimes too. She's very good at that. I used to live less than 2 miles from the world's oldest living lung transplant. His name is Hal Graham, and he actually just passed away a year ago this past October. He had a stroke. He had his lung transplant in 1990, which was the year I graduated high school. And he was the first person in the southeastern US to get one. And he passed away from a stroke, of all things. And when they did his autopsy, they said his lungs were perfect. They were fine.
Did they tell you anything about the lungs you got, or who you got them from, or anything?
Yeah, well, when I went through this, and I don't know if it's the same process nowadays, there is, there's UNOS, it's the United States Organ Procurement Agency, and then every state has their own agency. And then when I went through, what you did was you would write a letter, like you were writing it to the donor family, and you would send it to the Carolina Donor Society, is the one in North Carolina, and just say whatever you wanted to say. They would wait a proper amount of time for grieving and then send it to the family, and then it's up to the family whether they contact you back or not. But I didn't do mine right away, because what people fail to realize when you talk about stuff like that is, there are certain things that I would love to know. I don't know who my donor was. I would love to know male, female, how they passed away, all the normal stuff. But what you have to realize is once you open that door, you're going to find out everything about that person, who they left behind, all of that stuff. So it took me, I think, 2 years before I wrote the letter. And I wrote 2 letters, and I never heard anything back. But I do know, a little white mouse told me, that they know who I am, and they follow me in the news and stuff like this. And that's good enough for me. As long as they know that I'm not wasting the gift that they gave me, then that's fine with me.
How on earth do you swallow 36 pills?
38.
38? Okay.
Not at once. Not all at once.
How?
Henry has a phobia of swallowing
doesn't
water.
Yeah.
I
He
can't
will
even
not
do
swallow a pill. So if you have any
Well-
inspirational guidance here, would you
Well,
How?
well, you have to realize that I grew up taking pills. I've taken pills all my life. I take pills now without water. It's just one of those things. It's different for me because I've always done it. So when I had my lung transplant, it's different pills, different color pills at a different time. Somebody who has like a heart transplant or something like that may have taken one heart medication and a multivitamin, going from that to taking 38 pills a day.
Will you be able
That's
to
a
clean out
big.
ever, or?
No, it's a double-edged sword. The life that I've lived in is success. A lot of times they do wean people off and everything, but my transplant doctors, they're like, I'm not bragging, they have told me I'm the most athletically successful double lung transplant ever. So I get to have fun conversations when I go to the doctor, like, hey, when you die, can we have you? You know, so it,
When you die,
yeah. So it, you know, it, I don't know where I was going with that, but they don't mess with my medications. They're like, we're not doing anything with yours, so.
Leanne asked if you take
here's my second.
I don't, hold on a second, Henry. I don't take Trikafta because I know some people after lung transplants have been known to, but I'm in clinical research for pharmaceuticals, which is kind of a job that I just stumbled into, but then it became rewarding because I realized if there weren't people like me before, then I wouldn't be alive. So that's what goes on in my crazy brain. But I actually worked on the predecessor to Trikafta, Kalydeco, in my career, so that was pretty rewarding.
Do you still have CF symptoms?
I still technically have CF, so that's a great question.
Symptomatic?
Not in my lungs. So everything else, sinuses, still have to take pills when I eat, all of that is still normal CF stuff. It's just when they take the lungs out, the faulty chromosome that's in the lungs, when they put the new ones in, is corrected. So, but everything else, it's still there.
Like the one thing on your bucket list, like the one thing that you wanted to like accomplish. Like you wanted to do this more than touching a star.
Yeah. Number one was to walk again.
Yeah.
Simple as that. Number two was to get back to the point where I could go surfing with my friends. And then everything else is
That'd be fun.
superfluous after that, yeah.